So this is Project 2, and this is all about trying to identify what are the barriers for smaller scale growers to get their trees harvested. And we looked at this in terms of we want to get a satisfactory return on investment for the smaller growers. Lou and I have both worked with private growers for a long time now in this region and with private growers elsewhere in Australia as well. So we used our own experience largely in working through this particular project, but we also relied on a number of growers that live in the region, including two of them, Michael Cornish and Peter Feast, who are both sitting in the middle of the auditorium, but a number of other small-scale growers as well that were able to give us useful tips of things that have troubled them in getting their own plantations harvested. From the early 60s right through to probably the early 90s, a number of organisations have encouraged tree growing on farms in this region, and we've been semi-successful, but probably not as successful as we would like, and there have been a number of smaller scale growers in this region. So, but really in the last decade there hasn't been a lot of support for the smaller scale grower. And this is one of the reasons that this project's come about. How can we provide information to support the growers? And we identified there were 8 key barriers for the smaller grower to get their trees harvested. The first one was to do with the value of the plantation. The next one was silvicultural options, particularly the softwood sector. Next one is where the woodlot is located in relation to markets. The next one, where the woodlot's located on the farm in relation to where trucks can go. And then there's the plantation scale, a small scale plantation versus a larger scale plantation. The biggest barrier is the log sale process. We'll talk a bit about that during this presentation, but that's where smaller scale growers really do need assistance from someone outside, because it is a very complex thing to work through, the log sale process. Barrier 7 was to do with contractor availability. We've got a lot of logging contractors in this region, but they're mostly locked into the larger scale growers, so I'll talk a bit about that in a moment. And then the pre-harvest considerations, and again I'll have a small amount to say about that. So the first barrier was plantation value. One of the things that Lou and I have both found in working with small growers is invariably they don't know what the trees are worth. And I guess the other thing too is that both the hardwood and the softwood plantations are grown for a long period of time. So the person that originally put in the plantation might have had some pretty firm ideas about what was going to happen to those trees and what they were worth. But often by the time that Lou and I have got to talk to the grower, it may not be the same person who put the trees in the ground, or it may be that they were put in the ground so long ago that the person who put them in can't remember exactly what it was that we were growing the trees for. So plantation value is a significant issue. And as an example, you probably do know that in the last decade or so there was a boom in log exports to China, pine log exports to China. Massive volumes of wood were going out over the port. And down here, a lot of the smaller scale growers were knocked on the door, can we buy your wood off you? And these weren't buyers from this region, they were buyers from outside the region who were coming in here to wanting to buy wood from these smaller scale growers. There were 2 things that we saw from that. First of all, did the grower know what those trees were worth to say, well, yes, you can take my trees? Invariably they didn't know. But the other thing was, a lot of these plantations weren't mature. They were cut down at less than age 20, pine plantations, with the grower not realising that there was a lot more money to be made if they could have thinned the plantations rather than clear fell them and grow them on to age 35 or whatever. So plantation value is an important thing. Now values depend. They depend on how much harvest volume we're going to have, what the annual costs we're going to have, what are the harvesting costs, the once-off harvesting and haulage costs? The cost to get a truck to that plantation, and the species and the log categories within those species. They're all variables that make up plantation value. I'm not going to talk today about the ways you value plantations, but essentially in Australia there are a number of ways we value plantations, but the three main ones are the cost-based method, which is what is the cost to get it to where it is now, the lump sum method, which is you cut them down on the day that you assume you cut them down on the day you value them, and that's the wood that goes into the market, or the present value system, which is using a discounted cash flow to look at the future costs and revenue and bring them back to today's dollars. So one thing that we did was developed a kind of a matrix about indicative values for plantations. So we've got here hardwood values on the left and softwood values on the right, and we split these are in value per hectare, and we split them into age classes. So 0 to 2, 3 to 5 years old, 6 to 10, 11 to 15 for the hardwoods, and they go up right up to 31 to 35 years of age with the softwoods. And we looked at a low value, a medium value and a high value plantation. So you can see that high value plantations are obviously worth a lot more, and the difference between the low and the high value is a low value plantation was generally one that was a long way from the market, so it had high harvesting costs and poorer productivity, so harvesting costs were more, so harvesting and haulage costs were more, and the high values were fast-growing plantations close to the market with a product that the customer wanted. The next one, barrier number 2, is silviculture. Now, silviculture is the science of growing trees for a set objective. Because we're talking about existing plantations, we're not, in this particular presentation, we're not talking about the silviculture of growing the trees up to harvest age. We're really talking about the silviculture of once they're semi-mature or mature, and what do you do from there. With the hardwood plantations in this region, we're growing them to make a product for making paper, so it's wood chip is what we ultimately want, and what gets harvested out of the trees is either pulp logs or wood chip, but ultimately it's all turned into wood chip, and the trees are grown over a relatively short rotation, which Braden talked about before, 12 to 15 years. There's not a lot of silvicultural issues with that. You just want to make the most you can out of your Tasmanian bluegum plantation. But with softwoods, because we're thinning the softwoods, there's a lot more things to take into account. We need to take into account when to thin, what's the stocking to thin, when do you finally harvest. Also for this region, we looked at the ABARES work that takes into account all the productivity out of the whole region, and ABARES do this work about every 5 years by consulting with all the major growers. And in this region, the mean annual increment, the growth rate of our hardwood plantations is about 17 cubic metres per hectare per year, or green metric tonnes per year. They're roughly the same. And with softwood, it's about 22 green metric tonnes per hectare per year. So in terms of growth rates are determined by the site rainfall, soil depth, soil fertility, impacts of pests and diseases. All those things will impact the growth rate. And so the harvest yield depends on the growth rate and the age of harvest. Now, for the softwood plantations here, we describe the plantations in terms of what we call site quality. And for this region, we've got 7 site quality classes, where site quality 1 is the best class and site quality 7 is the worst. We don't have very many plantations at all in the region now that are site quality 6 or 7. Pretty well everything is site quality 5 or better. That certainly wasn't the case when I was a young forester. We had a lot of site quality 6 and 7 back in those days, but we've improved a lot since then. And the harvest age for softwoods, that depends again on the growth rate. So if you've got a Your first thinning, T1 stands for first thinning, T2 second thinning and so on. A fast-grown softwood plantation, you'll do the first thinning at about age 10. A slower growing plantation, you might first thin at about age 15. And then once you've done the first thinning, about every 5 or 6 years, you'll do another thinning until you're ready to clear fell the trees. And in this graph, we've put together some indicative harvest yields for each of those thinnings by site quality. So for the first thinning, you'll see the site quality 1 and 2 plantations have a better yield per hectare than the site quality 5 plantations. But you'll also see that most of the volume that we get out of our harvest for softwood comes from the final harvest, the clear fell. And that's where most of the value, most of the revenue comes as well. So barrier number 3 is plantation location. Now, if you've already got a plantation in the ground and it's a long way from market, there's not a lot you can do about that, except that you've got to try and optimise the haulage cost, because it's haulage that will be your biggest cost if you're a long way from the market. And the way to do that is to make sure that you can use the largest capacity trucks that you can use over the roads near you. I've got 2 photographs there. The one on the left is a Pine B double truck. The one on the right is a Blue Gum A double truck. And around here now you'd see that nearly all of the trucks now are B doubles. We hardly ever have any of the triaxle semis anymore, but essentially the cost per kilometre is less for an A double, is less for an A double, which is less than a B double, which is less than a triaxle truck. So if you're a plantation that's a long way from market, really the only thing you can do is make sure that you can get the most efficient haulage system to reduce those sort of costs. Barrier number 4 is where the plantation is located on the farm. Now, the best place to locate the plantation on the farm is right next to the road. But where is the plantation normally located on the farm? It's not usually right next to the road. It's usually at the paddock that probably wasn't as a productive farm paddock as the rest of the farm, so that's a good place to grow the trees. And that's all well and good from the growing perspective, but when it comes time to harvest, you've got to somehow or other get those trees off that plantation to a truck that's got to drive on a road. And if you're going to use a B double or an A double, you're talking up to 90 tonnes of weight going over the road, so you need a reasonable sized road to put those trucks. We can move the wood from the stump when it's cut down by either a skidder or a forwarder a certain distance to the truck, but really once you get much beyond about 400 metres of using a forwarder, it's just getting a bit too expensive to use a forwarder to move it to the truck. So you've got to start then building a road to get your truck closer to the plantation. And building roads on farms is not cheap. We're talking about building a road for an A double or a B double. You're talking $18,000 to $25,000 per kilometre to build this road. So you do have to think, when you're putting in new plantations, you need to think about that. But when you've got an existing plantation, you also need to recognise you need to build a road to get there. I've got a couple of examples I'm going to use in this one and in the next slide, and that is, if it's a middle of the road sort of farm plantation and the harvest yield you're going to get off it is about 2,500 tonnes, and you've got to build a 250 metre length road to get to that plantation to get your logs out. If you're going to harvest about 2,500 tonnes, it's going to cost you about $2 a tonne in roading costs that's going to come off your profit for your plantation. If you're only harvesting half that amount, if you've got a smaller plantation, it's going to cost you about $4 a tonne to get that wood out over a 250 metre road that you've got to build for your plantation. So these are things for a smaller grower to think about. Barrier number 5 is the plantation scale, the size of the plantation. Ideally, the bigger the plantation, the less we have a whole lot of fixed costs that we have with any plantation. These fixed costs include preparing harvesting plans, getting the environmental compliance for the plantation, and moving the harvesting equipment to the farm. Those are all fixed costs. If you've got a small plantation, small-sized plantation, those fixed costs per tonne that you sell become a greater cost. And for example, with the harvesting equipment, we're talking the harvester itself, a skidder or a forwarder, and maybe a loader. To move that gear to a farm is probably going to cost around $2,000. Flight costs aren't cheap these days. If you're harvesting a large area, the harvesting contractor will just say, well, I'll just absorb that cost as part of my harvesting operations. But if it's a small plantation to be harvested, the logging contractor is going to want his costs covered for moving that gear there. So using our same example I had for the previous slide, if it's a 2,500 tonnes of wood that you're going to harvest off that plantation, it'll cost you about 77 cents that's what the contractor will charge you to move that equipment to his farm, to your farm. If it's half that amount, then it's going to cost you about $1.50 for that contractor to move the equipment to the farm. So the plantation scale is important. The larger the wood lot size, the more harvest volume there is to absorb those fixed costs. Barrier 6 is the log sale process, and this is the thing that is probably the most difficult thing for small-scale growers. And I guess we need to look at the context of this. The processors in the region, they have their log supplies lined up quite some time ahead, 18 months to 2 years ahead. They know where their wood's going to be coming from. So they've got everything all scheduled. They're going to knock over this block of 141's plantation first, and then they're going to go to a Timberlands one next, and they know exactly where all that wood's coming from. If you're a small grower, you've somehow got to get into that schedule. So you can't expect to knock on the door of a sawmill and say, look, I want to get my plantation harvested, can you do it in the next couple of months? Because that's just not going to happen. And I'm using the term broker here, and I'll use that again for the next couple of slides as well. It's really important to have a broker in the process that can help you, because even the larger scale growers here and smaller growers, and I'm looking at Michael Cornish in particular in the middle of the room there, who harvests trees every year on his property. Even Michael, who's got a large area of plantation, would need a broker to help him sell those trees. For a smaller scale grower, it's really important to have a broker to help you sell those trees. And the broker will help you with preparing the harvesting plans, talking to councils about which roads that you need to use to where the log trucks are going to go, and talk to the buyers of the wood and arrange a deal for you. Also with pines, you've got to work out when you're going to thin them, what are the products that are going to come out, and unless you're dealing with this thing every day, it's very hard to know that you're going to get 500 tonnes of pulpwood and 650 tonnes of Class 1 sawlog and so on. So it's important to have somebody to help. The other thing about the log sale process, Braden touched a bit on this in his presentation, but when we measure standing trees, we measure in volume, in cubic metres, because when we measure trees in a plantation, we measure the diameter and the height, we calculate the volume of the tree, and then we work out with our sample plots how many trees there are, and we can work out what the cubic metres per hectare are. But when you cut a tree down, you can either have the measurement in cubic metres, that's when it's on a log truck and each end gets measured or whatever, and you know the length of the log, but mostly these days the product gets weighed over a weighbridge. Now, here in the region, it's roughly about, for pines, it's roughly about 1 to 1. 1 cubic metre is 1 tonne of pine log. It's not quite the same as that for blue gum, but it's not too far off it. But so what it means is when you're measuring your standing trees to work out how much volume you've got there, you're talking cubic metres, but you've got to remember that when you sell it, it's more than likely going over a weighbridge. And for the softwoods, we need to take into account the different log sizes, the lengths, the small end diameters, the straightness. So then we come to the mill door price. what is the price that we're going to get for this wood? And this is another thing that's secret. It's very hard to know this information if you're a small grower. So in this project that Lou and I worked on, we've developed some indicative Mildor prices for the types of logs that you can sell out of your softwood plantation. And we looked in terms of a low Mildor price, a middling Mildor price, or a higher Mildor price, and that'll depend on the quality of the wood and those sort of things. So the Mildor price is the price that the buyer will pay for the wood to be delivered to that mill. There's also the cost then to harvest the wood and transport the wood and supervise the plantation operation. Those costs need to be considered when it comes to what a grower will actually get. So you can see there we looked at small saw log, large saw log, industrial log, which is break trees and smaller logs, pulp log and preservation log, and you can see that the larger saw log gets the best price in this region. Barrier number 7, contractor availability. The critical thing here is there are no contractors in this region that operate only for small growers. We've got lots of contractors in this region, really good logging contractors, but they all work on a contract basis to the larger growers, and their contracts are anywhere between 1 year and 5 years in length. So they have their own wood harvesting programs ahead of them, so there aren't any contractors that operate just for the small growers. So that's one of the reasons another reason why you need a broker to help you get your foot in the door about which contractor that we can use to harvest our trees. You can see the sort of equipment that we're talking about there. There's forwarders, skidders and harvesting machines. And the last barrier was pre-harvest matters. So there are 3 main things to consider from a pre-harvest point of view. What sort of volume that we're going to harvest, so you need some sort of inventory. Again, a broker can help you with that. We need a formal harvesting plan, and the requirements for harvesting plans are different in Victoria to South Australia, but they're not that different. And if you're growing blue gums, we need to consider native animals, in particular koalas. And just a little thing about koalas here, some research that's been done in the last 5 or 6 years has shown that the blue gum plantations that are in that area between the state border and probably the other side of Portland, the number of koalas per hectare in there are about 4 times the number of koalas in ideal koala habitat in native forest. 4 times the number of koalas. So once you get into harvesting of blue gum plantations, if you're in a koala area, you've got to have a koala management plan. And again, a broker or someone can help you with these, because these are actually quite complex things. And with the larger blue gum companies, they'll have someone probably full-time working on koala matters. So that comes to the end of the barriers. So just to sum up, the small-scale growers are only a small part of the region here. It's the large-scale growers make up about 96% of the entire plantation estate here. So the small-scale growers don't have a lot of clout when it comes to these things, and we've identified there's 8 barriers there that you need to consider when you're harvesting your small-scale plantations. There are fixed costs, so if you've got a larger scale plantation, those fixed costs get spread over more tonnes that you harvest. But it is the log sale process is complex, and a broker is essential for a small scale grower. And that's the end of that presentation. Thank you.